Hello, and now I'm going to be talking you through the aims of the Robbers Cave study. The first aim was to use a field experiment to create group norms to measure the effects on perception and judgment of those involved in the experiment, which is creating an in-group and an out-group and seeing whether there's any pre-judgment involved. Researchers also wanted to see how in-group behaviour developed between the groups. The researcher aimed to trace the formation and function of the negative and positive attitudes of members in one group and the other group. It was also a study of intergroup relations, which is where they create an understanding of different people, that meaning gender, race, and religion. Now I'll be talking you through the procedure of the Roberts Cave study. The participants were 22 boys, aged 11 years old, who did not know each other before the study was carried out. The boys were matched as far as possible and split into two groups of 11. They are all from Protestant families in Oklahoma and were screened to eliminate problems at home or other difficulties that might account for the individual attitudes and behaviour. As part of the matching process, the boys were rated by teachers. When the boys were divided into the two groups, they were reassessed, also matched for the split, including issues such as sporting ability. In order to produce natural groups, participants were not informed that they were a part of a study and were kept unaware of the aims of the camp. A nominal fee was charged for the camp and parents were asked not to visit, ostensibly because it might make the boys homesick. Now we'll be moving on to the data collection techniques that they used. The first one was observation, which is a participant observer was allocated to each group for 12 hours a day. The next is sociometric analysis, which is issues such as friendship patterns were noted and studied. The next is the experiment. The example is the boys had to collect beans and estimate how many each boy had collected. And lastly, tape recordings, adjectives and phrases used to refer to their own group members and to out-group members were examined. The participant observers were trained not to influence the boys' decision-making, but to help them once decisions had been reached. The researchers claimed that using different data gathering methods with similar results meant their results were valid. The camp. The camp location was a 200-acre Boy Scouts of America camp, completely surrounded by a Robbers Cave skate park. The site was isolated and kept two groups of the boys apart. At first was easy because of the layout of the site.
Okay, so these are the results of the study, and I'm starting with stage one, which is the in-group formation. Boys would divide themselves into two groups, so the rattlers and the eagles. The rattlers discussed a lot about the other existing group, but the eagles were not very bothered about the rattlers. But then in the end, they started to become competitive and asked to play games against the other team, so the rattlers. Their cabins were situated in different places, which already divide them, and it affected the way that they made their decisions. Both of the teams recognized a leader, so they chose a person who was going to be in charge. So both of the groups then had their own leaders, and that's pretty much it for stage one. Okay, so now we're going on to stage two, which is the inter-rater relations, the friction phase. So the boys naturally moved themselves into this phase by asking to compete in a game of baseball. So they ended up deciding a baseball captain, but then the baseball captain wasn't the same leader as they had previously in stage one. But then the baseball captain ended up being the leader like throughout stage two. The rattlers in the baseball game were excited. So they were excited about the game and discussed issues. So they discussed issues such as protecting their flag. Oh my god. We're now on to the final stage, which is stage three, which is the intergroup relations again, but then this time it was the friction integration. The psychologists tried to get the boys to working together again. Initially, when the boys met, there was still hostile again, like there was still hostility between the groups. So they made comments such as "ladies first." So the psychologists started to try to get the boys to work together through a subordinate goal, and they had some three subordinate goals. So the first goal was to fix a damaged water supply because they staff turned off the water supply, and then the boys had to restore it. So the boys had to restore it, and when they restored it, they were rejoicing together. And then on to the second goal, the boys had to chip in to buy a movie, and they paid equal amounts, which also indicates working together. So they thought they were equal, so they ended up paying equal amounts, even though the Eagles had lost two boys due to homesickness. On the final goal, the boys had to go on a trip, which included getting transport. And then, just before the truck left, it developed a problem. This problem was obviously one of the variables to get the boys to work together. So to fix the truck, the boys they used a tug of war rope to get it started. So which involved like pulling it to make it start, and that was another stage of these are the quantitative results from the study representing the rattlers and the Eagles. So for the first one, we have the in-group choices of friends, and the results here show that most people had friends from their in-groups. So they had 63.6%, the rattlers, and the Eagles had more of their own group of people as friends at 76.8%. And the second one, out group choices of friends, they only had 36.4% and 23.2%. For the out group friends at the end of stage 2, the results were very low. Only 6.7% in the rattlers and 7.5% for the Eagles. At the end of stage 3, however, there were 36.4% friends from the out groups and 23.2% for the Eagles. And these are the results of the study.
Pick and match participants ruled out home backgrounds or individual factors that would explain the attitudes and behaviour of the boys. The groups developed group norms, although they were not stable throughout the study. Follower-leader relationships were developed as a result of having to solve problems through combined actions as group structure stabilised and in-group formed. In-group solidarity and cooperation increases and inter-group hostility is strong. The contact between two groups is not enough to reduce hostility. When groups needed to work together, exchanged tools, shared responsibilities, and agreed how to solve problems, friction was reduced.
Strengths. There was careful planning and controls. Previous studies were used to show what was necessary. For example, the need to enable the groups to develop as naturally as possible, and to brief observers not to advise when decisions were being made. The participants were matched carefully, so that individual differences would not affect their attitudes and judgments. The planning and controls enabled cause and effect conclusions to be drawn confidently. The researchers used participant observers because they knew from the previous research that participants' behavior is affected when they know they are being watched. The participants did not know what they were part of an experiment, so their behavior was natural. Several data collection methods were used so that the findings could be compared to make sure that they were valid. Weaknesses. Informed consent was not obtained. The boys did not know that they were part of a study, which meant that there was deception. Parents were informed more fully, but they were asked not to visit and could not check whether the boys were happy at the camp. Debriefing is not mentioned and may not have taken place. The researchers wrote a book about the study, but some ethical issues are not considered. However, the account does not suggest that the boys were treated unethically or were unhappy. It might be difficult to generalize the findings beyond the type of participants used because they were so carefully selected. They were 11-year-old boys from similar family and school backgrounds and with fairly similar abilities. It might therefore be hard to say that findings would be true of others. For example, girls, those in other cultures, those with difficult backgrounds, and those with less sporting ability. Generalizing is difficult when the sample is restricted, even though the restriction was deliberate to help the study.